So thanks again for coming along today. I will see whether I can just move that along. So just to give you a little bit of context about the DAD survey, this is actually the sixth in the series of DAD surveys that we've put together. We started during the first lockdown back in June 2020, and we've done one or more surveys every year since then. So this year's survey took place in June. And over that time period, we have heard from 2,300, in fact, in excess of 2,300 ordinary Scottish dads from across the nation, different with different ages of children, from different locations, from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So we feel as though we've done a reasonably good job of hearing dads' voices and making sure that they've been heard. So as I said, we started this process during the first lockdown during the pandemic, and actually a huge amount has changed from pre-pandemic to now. So this is some information that the Fatherhood Institute put together, I think, back in 2022. And it shows, this is a clock face, and it shows the number of minutes that dad spends doing or undertaking unpaid childcare compared to an hour that a woman will spend. So pre-pandemic, during 2014 and 15, dads were spending just under half the amount of time of women on unpaid childcare. That rose significantly during lockdown. So apparently, according to the ONS, childcare during the first lockdown rose from just over 4 to 8 hours per day for fathers, while mothers rose from almost 7 to just over 10. So women were doing more during lockdown, but dads were kind of catching up during that period, and you can see it from this clock face. Dad's undertaking 53 minutes to mum's 60 minutes. And I suppose cynically, we all thought that we would probably, after the lockdowns had happened, that we would go back to pre-pandemic levels. So we'd go back to dad's doing about 30 minutes to mum's hour. That simply isn't the case, actually. So in 2022, dads are actually continuing to do 39 minutes to mum's 60 minutes. So obviously mums are still doing more, but dads are doing a significant amount of the childcare. And we can see these figures again in the stay-at-home parents. So in 2019, 1 in 14 stay-at-home parents was dad. In 2022, that's now 1 in 9. So that's kind of just to give you a sense of what's been happening since the pandemic. More recently, obviously, we've gone through a global economic crisis, really. And since our last survey in June 2023, the cost of living crisis has continued to bite. So in Scotland, there is a study called the Understanding Scotland Report, which is a quarterly report that looks at just the population across Scotland. So they aggregate information from people across Scotland and then report on it to give a sense. Essentially, it's a little bit like the DAD survey, so to give a sense of what's happening within Scotland. And in May 2024, it talked about the ripple effects of worsening financial well-being. And my feeling is that the DAD's report, which is undertaken at a similar time, shows exactly this. It says more than half of Scots report deteriorating financial health compared to the previous year. This decline is associated with significant impacts on mental and physical health, interpersonal relationships, and effectiveness at work, highlighting the profound impact of financial strain on overall well-being and the interconnectedness of individual finance well-being and broader societal welfare. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I feel as though it really illustrated what we are seeing in the DADs report. So I'm going to pass over to Jessica now.
Thank you, Kathy. I will just ask you to move the slide forward when I'm ready, if that's all right.
Okay.
Great. So I'm going to talk about some survey design. So as Kathy mentioned, this is the 6th survey that we've done since 2020. So I'm going to tell you a bit about who the population were that we were speaking to. But firstly, what we wanted to find out. So, given the considerable financial pressures that Kathy's just mentioned, we wanted to know whether the quiet childcare revolution, the changes that we were seeing in dads spending more time in childcare and play with their children at home, were those shifting? Were they faltering, or were they staying the same? And we also wanted to know, with these increased financial pressures, how dads and families were coping. And that's what we were looking to find out for the survey this year. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the survey design, it's quite a short survey. We collected the data between the 1st and the 30th of June in this year. We used a digital survey tool called Wufoo. We publicized the survey directly through the Fathers Network's newsletter. We also use social media channels, so Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn, as well as it was publicized indirectly through a network of partner organizations. So in total, the survey collected 409 responses. We didn't use any incentives to collect data. The survey is anonymous, but if participants would like to, they can leave their name and contact details so they could take part in future research activities. Just to be clear as well, this is a cross-sectional survey each time, so it's not a longitudinal study. We're not speaking to the same fathers. We're taking a snapshot at each stage of where dads are at. So there have been some consistent sections to the survey each year, and there's some new bits. So something we always include is socio-demographic information, so around the ages of the dads, marital status, their levels of education. We also ask them for their postcode if they're happy to share that, because that helps us to understand if we have an even demographic spread across Scotland. We'll ask about their family situation, number of children and the ages of their kids, and then where they live. Do they live with their kids or not? Home and work, childcare and housework have been a big part of the survey since it started. Also work-life balance and the attitude of employers to parental responsibilities were introduced, so that's a key part now. Of course, mental health, impacts on mental health and the stresses that are affecting dads, and support that they've accessed, if they have accessed any. And then we ask about relationships. So we want to know about their own subjective rating of the quality of their relationships with their child, and then with their co-parent. Each year as well, we will include some wildcard questions. This year, those were related to play and community, but that's not the topic of today. That's going to be coming in the new year. Next slide, please. Thank you. So age and location. So you can see from the left-hand chart there that most of the dads were aged between 25 and 64, which is what we'd expect. We have very few dads in the 18 to 24 or 65 plus bracket. Now, the dads had to have children under the age of 18 to take part in the survey. The average age of a first-time father in the UK is now 33.6 years old, according to ONS statistics. So the dads are just marginally older, most of them being aged between 35 and 44. We also collected postcode data. So 321 of the dads who took part were happy to share their postcodes with us, and that let us see that across Scotland we had coverage in every health board area except for Shetland and the Western Isles. So it was pretty good. And in the main, we're slightly overrepresentative of Lothian, but they roughly match up with the proportion of the populations in those areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next part is looking at education and deprivation status. So we do see that a lot of the dads, 71% of them, had either completed college, university, or a postgraduate qualification. And this is higher than what we'd see in the general male population in Scotland. It's just under 30% who have a degree qualification. So we can see that the dads who are responding to our survey are more qualified than an average dad. The next graph is the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So for anybody who's not familiar with this, it's a tool used by the Scottish Government to look at domains of deprivation, including income, employment, education, housing, and access to services. So it uses that information, and the different postcodes in Scotland are split into data zones, and then they are linked from SIMD 1, which is the most deprived, to SIMD 5, which is the least deprived. So we see a spread, which is probably what we'd expect for a study like this, because we have more people who are at the higher end, least deprived, and fewer people at the end who are most deprived. But overall, it's promising that we still have quite a few people in the more deprived areas who are responding to our survey. So we are reaching people, just not completely equally. Next slide, please. You. So the children, most dads had one or two children, definitely the majority. We do have some dads in there who've got 4 or more kids, but most people have one or two, 81%. And most of the dads who responded to the survey had younger children this year. So 65% of them had children in the early years, under 5. And yeah, we've got the smallest group is with teenagers, 13 to 17 years old. Next slide. Thank you. So, marital status. Majority of the dads are married or in a cohabiting relationship, so 81% of them. And that the cohabiting and married population, we've kind of combined together for that. And then we have single divorced dads, some dads who are separated but still legally married, and then a very small proportion who are widowed. The other graph is telling us about their living situation. So the slight difference is that some small number of dads are married but not living with their children's other parents. So in that situation, it would be because, say, they're in a different relationship or a new marriage or something. So they are married, but they're not living with the parent of their child. Overall, a minority of dads live alone with their children, and we found that 5% had little or no contact with their kids. And we're going to talk more later about the impact that that has on the dads and the children. And now I'll hand back to Kathy, who's going to tell you about the first key finding.
Thanks. So as I kind of hinted at earlier on, we're kind of delighted actually that we found that dads are remaining committed to positive engagement with their children post-COVID, despite the increase of financial pressure. So this graph shows it quite neatly, actually. So this is the number of hours that dads are playing with or supporting their children's learning. So you can see in the graph to the far right, which is more than 25 hours per week, you can see that the red column is this year's cohort, and it's 40% of dads are spending 25 hours or more playing with their children and supporting their learning. This is an increase from previous years. In 2022, it was 37%. In 2023, it was 34%. And we can also see these are kind of matched by the number of hours that dads are spending doing household chores. You'll see that there's a slight increase this year in the number of dads doing more than 10 hours of household chores. And again, the number of or how often dads are spending cooking is kind of actually, it's very similar to last year's, a slight increase, but not significant. So that's all good news, actually. So we can see this is a graph showing the number of hours that dads are playing with their children split into different age groups. So you can see the one at the top is dads with children under 1, and then the next one down is children age 1 to 2, and so on and so forth. So what we found is the group doing the most in terms of the age of their children are dads with children aged 1 to 2. Um, the disappointing thing is that the dads in the age group of 0 to 1, so those with a newborn, that number has decreased quite dramatically in the last year. So it's 13% lower than it was in 2022, which is a slightly worrying trend. And this year, however, dads with children 1 to 2 is 8% higher. So it might be that where mums are on maternity leave, the financial pressures around fathers to actually work during that first year has increased this year. And so more dads are going back to work while mums at maternity on maternity leave. But we don't know that for sure. So this is key finding number 2, probably more as you'd expect. Many more dads are struggling to balance work and family life, particularly new dads, as I'd mentioned, and dads on the edge of poverty, sort of in the pressured middle. So when we're talking about SIMD figures, that's SIMD 2 and 3. So as the findings show, is this the graph on the left-hand side shows over half of all of the dads that we surveyed are finding balancing family life either very difficult, 12%, or difficult, 39%. So that's just over 50%, 51% of all the dads that we surveyed. And you can see actually that that's a significant increase. So the dads are finding it very difficult to balance their work and family life, has doubled since last year. So it was 6% last year and 12% this year, which is pretty worrying. And as one dad said, feel like I'm letting down both children as I have no time to be fun with them during the week. Only do the functional stuff, bath time, bedtime, needed after work. So this graph might be a little bit tricky to interpret, the one on the left. So this year's figures are in the sort of the dark green color. And then last year's is pink, and then the 2022 figures are in the blue kind of color. So what you can see is that increasingly dads with very young children under 1 are finding it more and more difficult to balance their family life. So in 2022, just 9% were finding it very difficult compared to 18% this year. Those with 1 to 2-year-olds, actually, it's fairly similar last year and this year. So 13% were finding it very difficult last year, 14% this year. And those finding it difficult about the same. But as you can see, SIMD3, so that's the kind of the middle quintile, again, are finding it increasingly difficult to balance work and family life. Now, for the dads under 1, which are the most highly pressured group, you can see that just under half of all of those dads with children under 1 are saying that they almost never or do not often feel satisfied with the amount of time that they spend with their children and family. So dads on the end of poverty, on the edge of poverty. So previously, the previous 2 years, we've looked at socioeconomic differences, and certainly there's been a focus on SIMD1, both doing the most with their children, so effectively doing more with their children, but also having the most difficult time as well. That seems to have changed quite significantly this year, actually, with dads in SIMD2 and SIMD3 having a particularly hard time. So you can see on the left-hand side, that dads in SIMD2 and SIMD3, 17% of both of those groups are finding uh, balancing work and family life very difficult. So, and that's increased quite significantly from last year to this year. So SIMD2 That figure is 12% higher than in 2023, and SIMD3, which was 0 last year, is now 17%. So I'm going to pass back to Jessica now to tell you a little bit about father-child relationships.
Thanks, Kathy. So there is some good news. As you'd expect, the dads who filled out our survey in general said that their relationships with their children were great. So you can see here that 86% of dads who filled out our survey said that their relationship with their children was either very good, 63%, or good, 23%. And there's a lovely quote here. Some dad has said about his child, I love to see him copying me playing with cars or watching a video about babies. And then he'd play his daddy with the teddies, putting them to bed or putting on a nappy. Very practical. We do have a small proportion of dads who didn't say that their relationship was good. They said it was not great or very poor. I'm going to talk about them a little bit more later. Next slide, please. Thank you. Again, relationships with co-parents, and this is the entire sample, were generally positive. So there's 54% of dads who said that their relationships with their co-parent or partner were good or very good. But there is a sizable proportion, 23%, who said that they were not great or very poor. And we'll return to this, but research suggests, as you can see from the quote here, that regardless of family type, so regardless of whether parents are married, cohabiting, living together, separated, the children whose parents had a hostile interparental relationship tended to have poorer emotional well-being than children whose parents did not have a non-hostile relationship. And this study from Baxter and Weston spoke to both children and parents to ask them about that. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, as Kathy mentioned, one of the things that we've seen in this year's survey is it seems to be that the pressure on the kind of middle section in society in Scotland is increasing. So this graph shows you exclusively the dads who live with their other parent and exclusively the dads who've said that their relationship with their other parent is not great or very poor. So you can see in SIMD1, the most deprived communities, we would expect that we would see that because there'd be a lot of pressure on people, financial pressure, lots of different things. So that almost 20% of dads in that area have said that their relationship is very difficult. But 28% of dads in the middle section, SIMD3, have said that their relationship is very, very difficult. Now, usually we would kind of expect that as deprivation reduces, the quality of relationships would be rated higher. And so looking into this, into the qualitative data that we gathered, we found that we thought that it seems to be a combination of financial pressures and potentially lack of support networks that are having an impact on these families who were maybe previously more financially stable. So some of the quotes from dads in these in this bracket were, there's no one to help look after the kids, families are living too far away, money strains mean we argue a lot, and there's only one family income. And something that we saw a lot as well was that the pressure of childcare on parents in this group seems to be damaging their relationship quality as parents are not getting the time to spend together. So one dad said, childcare responsibilities leave no time for a relationship between me and my partner. And I'll pass back to you, Kathy.
Thanks. So our next key finding, and possibly the most alarming, I would say, when we got this data in, is how poor the mental health of dads is in Scotland. So poor mental health is at a record high. So it's the highest that we've ever seen. And fewer dads than ever are seeking support. So as you can see from this graph, 48% of all the dads that we surveyed said that their mental health was either not great or very poor. And you can see against the previous years, this is the highest that we've ever seen by quite some considerable margin. So of the dads who whose mental health had had gotten either slightly worse or much worse in the last 6 months. So you can see that's almost half of the dads, all of the dads that we surveyed. We asked them what they thought might have contributed to that, and we did some analysis on that. And the key issues that we identified were work. 40% of dads cited work, 30% cited money, 27% cited relationship difficulties, and 19% reported competing demands on their time. So I'm going to start off with money. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's used a lot in psychology, and it theorizes that our survival needs at the bottom of the hierarchy, so that's the psychological needs and the safety needs, must be met before an individual can satisfy the needs that are higher up. Not having enough money to meet our basic needs, or fear that this might soon be the case, can be a cause of extreme stress. It threatens our basic survival and puts at risk the human needs that lie above it, so safety, love, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. And these are just two quotes from dads that told us about the issues around their mental health. And you can see that cost of food has reached the point where it worries me most days. And another dad saying, I lost my job and the current benefits and universal credits don't cover food costs or fuel costs for my home, and it's only getting worse. So you can see actually how desperate these dads are. So 40% of dads also talked about their struggle to balance providing for their family and being present. Now, this sort of naturally follows on from issues around money, because obviously work is a primary means of dads getting money. So as one dad said, the cost of living has added tremendous financial pressure, which has doubled the pressure felt at work. I'm finding it difficult to be a good dad, husband, and solve our money problems. And I'm worried about money and work-life balance. Can't afford not to work as much as I do. Cost of living is really biting. I seem to be racking up debt, but don't qualify to help as we both work. Again, many of the dads told us about the mounting pressures they feel actually in work. So as businesses struggle themselves, they're being passed on to the dads at the receiving end. So one dad said, stressful job and work commitments mean additional hours required. At times, I struggle to switch to family mode and turn off work stress. And another dad said, chaos in my workplace and knee-jerk high-pressure ask on a continual basis. Most of these asking the same questions over and over again regarding savings in the workplace. And again, in terms of the hierarchy of needs, these huge fears around job security adding to this level of uncertainty and stress. So one dad's saying that there's been talk of redundancy, and another saying that he fears losing his job. So the other thing that we noticed when we were looking at this qualitative data is that 55% of the dads provided more than one cause for their deteriorating mental health, and 44% gave 3 or more separate reasons. It's likely that most of these multifactorial cases, that there's an inciting incident, so one thing that's happened that's caused other things, caused that ripple effect, which sets off a series of related issues, whereas one dad puts it, everything is going wrong. So this is a really good example, and there are lots and lots of these as you look through the dad survey data. Terrible finances, no support network, had to relocate from home city due to loss of living and housing crisis, lost all friends, never see extended families, new job without scope for sociability, and no flexible working. My partner is struggling even more than me, and I've nearly ended our relationship several times in the past 6 months. So in addition to just one inciting incident causing this ripple effect, causing this kind of cascade of problems, often you find that there's a life-altering event that's precipitated all of this other stuff. For example, the loss of a loved one or a serious health issue. So one dad says, my mum's been in hospital since February and has recently been diagnosed with cancer. So that has taken a massive toll on the family and me. Work has been a bit crappy recently, which hasn't helped, and everything seems to be more expensive, but wages haven't gone up to match the rise. And another dad saying that 3 of his friends under 40 had died within a 6-week period last summer. And just before Christmas, we realised that our youngest may have autistic spectrum disorder. Very little options for childcare, so almost no chance of spending time with my partner without a child present. So life-altering events. So 2 life-altering events that come up more often than others are obviously the transition into fatherhood, a fairly serious life-altering event, and also family as families separate, so or have separated, and these played large within the mental health discussions. So this is looking at dads not living with their children's other parents. So the graphs on the right-hand side show the differences. So the top one is dad's mental health. For dads who live with their children's other parent. So 8% of those dads are said that their mental health was very poor. For those that say that they are living alone with their children, that's 14%. And for those that told us that they live apart from their children's other parent, it raises to 20%. So double the number of those that are living with their children's other parent. Now, the most kind of striking, one of the most striking findings is the dads who have little or no contact with their children. So the second graph down to the bottom of those 2 graphs shows dads, the difference between dads who are living apart from their children's other parent, but have regular contact with their children, and those that have little or no contact. So you can see the ones that have regular contact are actually similar to the dads that live with their child's other parent. And the bottom one shows that massive difference. So those that have little or no contact with their children are struggling a great deal. So 41% of that group said that their mental health was very poor. So the stress and strain of relationships is often exacerbated by the public services responsible for ensuring child welfare after separation. So these 2 dads, not seeing my children and being accused of all sorts in the court system has very negatively impacted on my mental health. And another dad saying, having to pay court fees and solicitors' fees has basically crippled me. The debt is too much. And many are struggling as a direct result of being separated from their children. As one dad said, seeing my son every second weekend has killed my self-worth as a dad. I can't do anything about it, even though I'm trying so hard. It's impacted my self-worth, career, social interactions. I am a person who strives to achieve the best for myself and for the people I love. I lose hope every time I don't see my son. So I'm going to pass back to Jessica now.
Hello. Just to give some context on that, so this is looking again at the dad's relationships with their kids, and as we covered before, most of those very positive. A minority of dads, 4%, reported that their relationship with their child was either very poor or not great, 2% for each of those. I just wanted to make clear that for those dads, the primary reason that they said that their relationship was poor was that they didn't see their children, so lack of contact. And you can see you've got some quotes here. I don't see my daughter because her mother is hostile. So for dads that are not seeing their kids at all, this is primarily why they're saying their relationship is very poor. There was under 1% of dads who said that their relationship with their children was poor because their children had behavioral problems that were making it very challenging for them to have a positive relationship with them. But that was very, very, very low. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for dads who are not living with their children's other parent, before, of course, we looked at the quote which was talking about regardless of family type, the interparental relationship is really vital for them in terms of their own well-being, the children's well-being. And so what we're seeing from this graph is that dads who are living apart from their children and the other parent, they are rating their relationship with their co-parent as very poor over 50% of the time. So we can see that an area that is really affecting dads, children, families is that parents who are not living together, their relationships can really break down. They're very poor. You can see some quotes here. There's three different kind of aspects here, but one dad is saying, my ex-wife, the child's mother, doesn't want to know me, doesn't want me to be present in our child's life. So you can see that's affecting dad's mental health. It's also going to be affecting children's emotional well-being. Next slide is back to you, Kathy.
New dads. Sorry, I was just thinking, I was just getting into what you were saying there, Jessica. So the other group that is struggling with their mental health are new dads. As you can see, the graph, the top line is dads with children under 1. So 16% of those dads were saying that their mental health was very poor. Um, um, and that drops down to half that number when the children get to 1, and increases slightly again between 3 and 5. But 2.5 times the number of dads with children under 1 are telling us that their mental health is very poor, compared to the figures in 2022. So that was 6% in 2022, rising to 16% in 2024, which are very difficult findings, actually. 75% who live with their child's other parent cited one or more issues. With money, again, it's the same issues: money, work, competing demands on time. And this is a dad with a newborn who talked about the stress of juggling so many plates, from insane financial stress to managing things like booking nursery in time, to supporting my wife, and also somehow doing work as well. All that, and he wants to be a present parent. Once again, if we look at the relationship between the father and their partner, dads with children under 1 tell us that their relationship is very poor or not great. Now, 54%, so over half of those dads who told us that their relationship was very poor or not great also told us that their mental health was very poor. And the quote on the right-hand side was a dad reflecting on this period of having a newborn. The hardest thing I found with having a young child is that you have no time for your partner, or more so, the partner uses all the energy, patience on the baby. So sometimes you can feel like an emotional punch bag. We had really big arguments. It got really lonely at points. And due to the tiredness associated with having a baby, we haven't been nice to one another. A 1/3 of the children, of the dads with children under 1, experienced deteriorating mental health, but also reported poor sleep. This aligns to recent studies that have found a link between shortened sleep, poor sleep quality, with more conflictual interactions between romantic partners. So, as you can imagine, with a newborn, actually, that can have some fairly profound effects. So in terms of mental health support, this shows we asked the same questions for the last 3 years of dads whose mental health was poor, where they might have gone to seek support. As you can see, so the line in red is this year's findings compared to the last 2 years. So you can see the general trend is down. So dads are not seeking as much support as they have in previous years. So the number of dads who have shared how they feel with their partner is down to 62%. Those that have shared how they feel with friends and family has stayed actually similar to last year. I've spoken to my GP is down to 23%. I've spoken to another professional is down to 20%. Look for or receive support online or through a helpline has gone up a little bit on last year, and it might be that they're not seeking support from their immediate friend group, so they're looking elsewhere. And 11%, so the same for the last 2 years, have contacted or received support from a mental health support group. And what's most considering is that, most concerning is that 15% of all of these dads who are struggling with their mental health are seeking no support at all, which is extremely worrying. And you can see actually, I've looked in a bit more detail as to where dads with young children are looking for support. And you can see actually, so the red lines are dads with children under 1. Predominantly, they're sharing how they feel with their partner, and less so looking for support from other friends and families surrounding them. They also don't look, it seems, for support through professional channels. So only 16% of them had spoken to their GP, 4% had spoken to another professional, 8% had looked for or received support online or through a helpline. And so on and so forth. And again, 16% of them had looked for no support at all. And it's such a key period of transition that simply isn't good enough in my opinion. However, this does show a potential route to provide information about new dads' mental health and the struggles that they may face, or the challenges that they may face in that transition period. So new mums could provide a conduit for that information for new dads. So hopefully you've got a flavour for what we found through our dad survey this year. And I'm now just going to talk very, very briefly before we pass on to the panel, what we're calling for. So as you can see, as dads become increasingly involved in their children's lives, it's crucial that both parents are treated as equal caregivers by services to ensure the best outcomes for their children. So research clearly shows that children of positively involved fathers are more likely to be smarter, healthier, and more resilient. The responsibility both parents share for bringing up their children is clearly asserted in the UNCRC, which has just come into force in Scotland, as is the government's responsibility to help all parents raise their children. Yet, dads often don't believe that children and family services value their input or make the effort to involve them. 24% of children in Scotland are currently living in poverty. If we want to mitigate the poverty-related attainment gap widening over a child's lifetime, it's crucial to nurture strong family relationships and supportive parenting right from the start. We urge service providers, particularly those working with the most disadvantaged families, to think about how they're welcoming and supporting dads who are increasingly involved in their children's lives and uphold the UNCRC. So the second point is, and this will be familiar to Thomas, there's currently a lobbying group called Dad Shift that are trying to change policy in Westminster around this, and we support very much what they're doing. So with new dads finding the transition into fatherhood more difficult than ever, it's critical that the UK's parental leave is reformed to ensure that it is affordable for parents to take, gives a substantial allowance of time, and supports equality amongst parents. The UK statutory paternity leave is the worst in Europe. Dads and other co-parents get only 2 weeks off, paid at less than £185 a week. The research is clear. Adequate paternity leave is good for mums. It reduces the gender pay gap and rates of postpartum depression. It's good for dads. It leads to better bonding with their children and healthier and happier lives. And most importantly, it's good for children. It improves their well-being and performance at school. So we think that paternity leave in the UK should be substantial, gives dads enough time off to support their partner and bond with their children without taking leave away from mums. It should be affordable, paid at a rate that means everyone can afford to take it, and it should be equal, gives both parents equal leave, so mums and dads are free to shape their own roles in the family, not have them dictated by gender. Finally, as we contend with the most severe economic crisis in a generation, the government must support the whole family around every child and the services that support them. Our survey shows the serious impact of worsening financial well-being is having on dads in general, and almost half of all dads surveying tell us that their mental health was either not great or very poor. That's more than double the number in 2023. It's highlighted the disproportionate and growing effects this is having on dads with children 2 years and under. It is also affecting dads in the most deprived areas and alarmingly creeping into previously secure middle-income families. Although we welcome the government's focus on tackling child poverty, we must ensure that the support for families is holistic and also seeks to support dads at risk of falling into poverty. The services that support these dads and families have not been immune to the economic crisis, and funding continues to be a present and serious challenge. As a matter of urgency, we are calling for the government to ensure that appropriate and sustained levels of funding are available to ensure more families are not driven into poverty and crisis. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening to me. What I'm going to do is hand over. I might stop sharing just for a moment, actually, and hand over to our panel of experts. So we're really lucky today to have Carole Erskine from Pregnant and Unscrewed, Professor Anna Tarrant, who is heading up the Following Young Fathers Further initiative down south. We've also got Thomas Lynch from DADx and our own Scott Mair, who've joined us today. So what I might do actually is just get each one of the panel members to just say hello, introduce themselves, and tell us a little bit about themselves. So Carole, would you mind going first?
Sure, no problem, Kathy, thank you. And thanks for the report. Really, really interesting to hear what came out of the survey this year. I work for Pregnant and Unscrewed. I started last summer doing policy and campaigns for them in Scotland, really looking at the devolved issues, particularly around childcare challenges in Scotland. But we are a UK-wide organisation. We really seek to protect, support and promote the rights of pregnant women and mothers. We do that by carrying out research, and we also run a support services line for mothers and women that are experiencing pregnancy and maternity discrimination.
Thanks, Carole. Anna?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be here today, Kathy. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Lincoln, so quite far down south, I think, compared to Scotland. I've been researching men's care responsibilities in low-income family contexts for about the last decade now. I published a book in 2021 called Fathering and Poverty that looked at men who are marginalised as fathers, so young fathers aged 25 and under, single fathers or people who are parenting on their own, and male kinship carers. So seeing the data today on fathers in deprived situations is really important. As well as that, I'm leading a major study that's funded by the Future Leaders Fellowship Scheme called Following Your Fathers Further, as Kathy mentioned, which has followed a cohort of young dads over, in some cases, a period of a decade. And we've looked at young fathers' support needs and their engagements with systems and services over time. To promote and embed father inclusion in a participatory way. And just recently, I've set up a new research centre at the University of Lincoln, Centre for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research, all designed to increase data collection around fathers and analysis of fathers as well and their experiences. That's me.
Thanks, Anna. And Thomas.
Geez, oh, how can I follow that? Seems like Anna's quite busy. She's got a lot going on. And can I just say, Carole Erskine, that is the best headshot I have seen. I love that headshot of you. You're so happy, isn't it? It's great. Hi, my name is Thomas. I'm the Chief Exec and co-founder of charity DADx. We've been doing this work for 13 years. We work in Edinburgh, Glasgow, North Ayrshire, and potentially Dundee, hopefully Dundee, coming soon as well. We run a range of services with our staff to support dads and to give them the tools they need, and mums as well, the tools they need so that their children have the best possible start in life.
Fantastic. And last but not by no means least, Scott, our very own Scott Mair.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Yes, my name is Scott Mair. I'm Head of Training and Community at Fathers Network Scotland, but I also set up quite a few different perinatal pathways for fathers to engage with mental health services, and multiple groups for fathers to engage with from a variety of different backgrounds, whether fathers live with their children or they don't. And we have a session tonight which specifically looks at birth trauma. So most of the conversations I have is around mental health in new fathers. Thank you, Kathy.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. So we'll endeavour, if we possibly can, to get to any very pressing questions that the audience have. But we've, just because we've got such little time and quite a lot of ground to cover, we've set up a series of questions for the panels to discuss. So I can't actually, Connor, can you just tell me whether you can see the first questions for the panel members? Oh, you're muted.
You're not sharing it currently.
Okay, all right. I'll just quickly share my screen. Okay. Oops. So can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Is that better? All right. Okay, so the first question that we've got relates to the stats that you can see at the bottom and the graph that you can see, the pie chart you can see on the left-hand side, sorry, the right-hand side. And I'm going to ask the first question of Carole, if that's okay, and then open it out to the rest of the panel. So, Carole, how do you think that the pressures that we're seeing on new dads, how do you think that they're affecting mum and the whole family unit? What are your perceptions of that?
Yeah, I think echoing what you were saying very much about the cost of living crisis is something that we hear as well. And I think what we come across very often is that having a child is often what causes a number of families to see their finances fall considerably, and in many cases pushes families into poverty. And that really comes about from our very poor maternity pay. You touched on it as well, Kathy, our paternity leave as well in the UK being so poor. And then also childcare costs. So we know from our own work and our own surveys that we've done that 4 in 5 parents in Scotland say childcare costs are the same or more than their income, and 65% have reduced their hours or left the workforce due to childcare challenges. So we hear all the time how difficult parents find it to access affordable, high quality childcare. And I think to your point as well on the impact that having a child has on your relationship, I don't think we do enough to prepare parents for actually what might happen, for the sleepless nights, for the impact that might have on the two people together. And I think as well, we're getting better at talking about mental health, but I still think there's a huge issue with mums who may go through a traumatic birth, that may be lucky to have their partner home for 2 weeks. You know, if you have a C-section, you can't drive or do anything for 6 weeks, but yet we're only looking at 2 weeks off for partners. So we can definitely echo very much of what we would see here. And I think, as I said, the cost of living crisis has really fed into a growing number of families feeling squeezed in every way possible.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be the case. And the report that came out that I referred to earlier in May certainly was showing as a nation that seemed to be the case. Actually, it's just where the poor finances on a micro level are really affecting mental health and well-being of society as a whole. I was just wondering, Thomas or Scott, do you have anything kind of further to add?
I do, but do you want to go first, Thomas, if you've got anything? No? Yeah, I just back up that point. What we're seeing, particularly from a mental health point of view, we're trying to support. My work predominantly is mums and dads, so that is the language that's going to be used for this conversation based on that research and casework, is where mums' mental health is particularly poor. And when we're looking at mental illness, for example, OCD in that period, after that 2 weeks, where there's little support sometimes from community teams, and maybe mum hasn't entered a mother and baby unit, it's dad or partner that's done the vast majority of that care. So it's increasing more anxiety and putting more in terms of that pressure from a mental health point of view on mum when they're trying to return to work. Where they work from home, it's a little bit easier to balance it during the day, but where they don't, it's actually creating more problems by not having that additional care. And then the workforce or the workplace maybe not fully understanding that, the impact it's having. So we are actually feeding back into the problem by not having more access. And then, as we've already discussed, we know the impact on cost of living. So it's almost impossible to take more than that 2 weeks or to try and squeeze more time out of it. So they're having to try and return to work. And in some of the groups that we run, particularly with dads, this is one of the main areas they're concerned about, is how do we offer? How do we support them? How do we maintain our own mental health? How do we adjust to parenthood? And again, Carole's fantastic point in terms of education. We don't fully prepare for what parenthood looks like. And we let people sort of figure it out as they're going through it. And then you add the cost of living, or you add a mental health problem, and it does become too much. Like that dad said, where everything seems to go wrong. You start to see the wheels coming off, and then we expect them after 2 weeks to go back to work. So it is, the system almost feeds into the problem, unfortunately.
Fantastic. And Thomas, have you got anything else to add?
I agree with what's been said, and just quickly to say, I think in the last couple of years in Scotland, we've seen an explosion of perinatal support, both NHS and third sector, and there's been a lot of investment in that, which has been brilliant. However, in the last few months, there's absolutely been a stalling of that investment, and there's been a freeze on lots of investment in perinatal support, and so therefore it feels like we're slipping backwards. It feels like we're losing ground. And, you know, everything seems to be very much still a very postcode lottery, in that some health boards are doing things consistently, but even within certain health boards, there's a lack of consistency with delivery for something like antenatal workshops, which we would say are quite important for mums and dads, talking about preparing parents. But, you know, we hear stories all the time about dads not being allowed to attend antenatal sessions because the room's not big enough, or there's actually no antenatal sessions because there's nobody to deliver it. So it's still very much postcode lottery, and there's a lack of consistency across Scotland, I would say.
Absolutely. And I suppose, Thomas, you and I have both been to different levels involved with the Dad Shift campaign that's happening south of the border predominantly. How much do you think that changes to paternity leave would actually help this situation? Because obviously it's quite serious, I would say. How much do you think it'll help?
It'll help hugely. I think the government's already gone a wee bit of a way down the road by saying that there's going to be rights, statutory rights from day one of employment, which will absolutely help. I was at the play park a couple of weeks ago with my 8-year-old, and I was talking to another dad, and there was lots of kids there, and he was saying to me, do you notice that there's a lot of kids who are 8 years old, and then they've got a younger sibling who's about 3 or 4 years old? And he was absolutely right. There was families in the park that we could see who have that age gap between their children, and that's I would argue that that's government policy having an impact on children and families, because families are potentially not having children until their first child is in education and in the system. So, you know, there's things that the government can do. So the Dad Shift campaign that people might have seen, they've had like the statues with the baby slings on them, and they've had an event at Westminster, and they're working with MPs in Westminster, and they're working with businesses. And as Kathy said, certainly we're supporting that, and we're part of that. And our hope is that we can get a commitment from the UK Labour government to say that they will review paternity leave and they will look at taking further action on it.
And Carole, on that same point, do you think that changes in paternity leave will help mums actually in the whole family unit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we campaigned before the election to have paternity leave paid at 90% of salary for 6 weeks. We're also part of the work that Dad Shift are doing with other organisations. Absolutely, and we also know it will impact the gender pay gap by 4%, which is quite a considerable amount. I mean, I just think it's inconceivable, myself having been through a C-section, to come home and having come out of major surgery with a brand new little person and then go home and there's very little support. You know, it's not the same now, but I had my second son in the pandemic and there was nothing. I didn't even see a health visitor or a midwife for a number of weeks. So I think there's definitely benefits, and it benefits to the whole family, to the child as well. And we know from our own work that dads want to be at home, dads want to help, dads can see the difficulty that mums are going through, and they want to be more involved, they want to help and be part of that. And it just seems inconceivable that we're still in a position where we have the worst rates. It's just bonkers.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's awful, really, that we're the worst in Europe, actually. So I'm glad you think that it will make a big difference to mums as well as dads, actually. Just moving on
Could
to...
I make a really quick point on that, Cathy?
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry,
really
Anna.
I just want to say that just having done research with men in deprived circumstances, I think it's a really positive universal policy change that we can make to support fathers in general. But sometimes men in deprived circumstances fall under the radar of paternity leave. So they may be in 0-hour contract work, they may be self-employed, and those men might not have any entitlements to paternity leave at all. So as much as this is a really positive step in the right direction, I think there's a call or a need for whole systems change whereby men in a whole range of different employment circumstances have the opportunity to spend that time with their child.
No, it's a really valid point, actually, Anna. As you said, I was quite shocked that that self-employed dads particularly just don't have any access to support at all, so they could immediately be going straight back to work. I mean, particularly in such trying financial times, actually, they're just forced back into that situation. And Scott, you must see that with some of the dads that you are involved with as well.
Yeah, definitely the self-employed side. I was just going to say we've got a dad that we're supporting at the moment, and his baby was born on the Monday and he was back at work Wednesday. Because self-employed. But what we tend to see, particularly if they work in construction, and it's when you sit and have these conversations, the time of year plays a big part. You know, if, for example, if baby's born during the summer, they really can't afford to take time off during the summer if they're self-employed and they work in construction, because they know in the winter they might lose some of that time back. Whereas if baby comes in the winter, you can't plan these things, we know. But from the conversations, you know, lots of dads have said that I just can't turn the work down in the summer. So I am going back to work within a few days, maybe a long weekend at best, which again, going back to the previous point, it does put extra pressure on mum in those situations to be trying to recover, heal, process everything that's happening and trying to sort of navigate that alone, which does put extra pressure on the relationship. So yeah, some really good points. And yeah, Anna's absolutely right. I think there's a huge aspect of families that will still not be supported no matter what we do in terms of paternity pay, unless we change how we support all families from lower demographics and looking at self-employed.
And presumably from a kind of maternal, or sorry, from an infant mental health perspective as well, it can have a profound effect on the infant. So if the parents are stressed before the birth and after the birth, it can have profound negative consequences for the child as well. So I think you kind of have to look at that whole family, don't you, actually, in those terms. So moving on, I'm going to see whether I can move. There we go. Can we see that okay? The next set of questions. So the next set of questions are around what changes practitioners working in perinatal settings are seeing on the ground. So Scott, this is really one for you. I think you work with perinatal professionals all the time. So I'll come to you firstly to find out whether those practitioners that are working face to face with families are seeing the effects of these financial pressures on the families that they're seeing, and the dads specifically that they're seeing?
Yeah, I think in the last 12 months, I think to go with the stats of what you've just presented very well, I must add, Kathy, is that, yeah, we see similar. We're seeing that change. We do hear quite a lot, dads don't talk, they don't engage. I say this every time we get the chance during these sessions. It's not entirely true. They need the permission to be vulnerable and platforms to do it on. And when we engage and ask questions, you get this sort of data. The financial responsibility one is definitely weighing very heavily, and we know that from speaking to practitioners as these conversations are coming up. We know the increased need for food banks. We also know that when we look at the sort of main roles, when you sit and talk to men and you look at what they see themselves in that role, no matter what we think as a society in terms of the shift of how we look at it, protect and provide are two things that are very important. So when there's financial pressures and when they maybe feel they're not able to provide in the way that they would like to, which then feels into they're not protecting them. The fact that a quarter of children, this is UK, so it's not specific to Scotland, but according to Bernardo's recent work, a quarter of children their parents will be engaging with food banks. So we know that that's like 3.4 million children. That's 6 times the population of Edinburgh. Of children in the UK, their parents are engaging with food banks, and 9 children in the average classroom at school this winter will be going cold in the evenings. So there is a massive impact on the family, and dads, because of the role that we feel, they are sort of taking that burden. Maybe that's not fair to say that it just falls on them. We know that both parents work now more than ever before, which is putting different dynamic problems on the family. We've seen that again in the data. But the practitioners are seeing the fact it's having a more negative impact. It does filter through. We know that we lose 12 men a day to suicide. And we know that children that lose parents to suicide are 5 times more likely to die by suicide. So there's a massive impact on the fact that, that there isn't necessarily the right services. You see the engagement from the statistics that you put in terms of, are we actually actively engaging to support mental health in this area? Are they taking it seriously because they're maybe not getting the permission or having conversations? They're not getting it validated during pregnancy about their own mental health. So it does build and it does build. And what we do know from so much research is obviously Movember at the moment is that the best way I ever heard it described during a presentation that Movember did was that men are like volcanoes and they need to vent to let the steam out or they erupt. And unfortunately, when they erupt, that's when we sometimes step in from safeguarding. So that's another issue that we're seeing is there's more and more need for men that are reacting in a certain way, and it does become aggression, unfortunately. So we're looking at the extreme end straight across it from family services, and we're not intervening early enough. So yes, we could talk about paternity leave, that's really important, but it's supporting that mental health at the beginning. That transition is so important, and having that engagement from the beginning does create a better environment for the whole family. We are aware of that, but practitioners are definitely seeing more need for support, sometimes having to turn it away, for example, when they are screening families. If we've got practitioners, we've seen it in the chat box, there is great work being done. It's an absolute privilege every day to talk to people across the UK, but predominantly in Scotland, that are working with families. If they screen dad, because we know that we can use the tools like the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale. In that beginning, we can screen dad, we can see there's a problem from the beginning. The issue is without those pathways to refer them into to get the support that they need when they need it, then you're just screening and telling them there's a problem. So sometimes when we work with practitioners, I understand that I need to engage with dad. I can see there's a problem, Scott. But if I start to have that conversation and he opens up, what do I do with him? Where do I send him? Where is those pathways? Where is the services available? So they're aware, they're almost stuck in the situation of we want to do more, we want to engage it, but without that support network behind it and places to send them. Like Thomas says, not everywhere's got the likes of Dad's Rocket. It is a postcode lottery. If you're in an area where you've got that support, it gives you the confidence to engage with these dads on a different level. Where you haven't got that, it makes it very difficult to do so, because then what do you do with the answer? It becomes your burden and your responsibility, and that's a lot of pressure to put on practitioners. So it's not a case of saying that they're not doing it or they don't want to. It's the fact that we do need a better infrastructure around them to enable them to have these conversations more, and that's the bit that I think has to change.
And Thomas, obviously you deal a lot with NHS Lothian. I'm just wondering whether you're hearing from practitioners about this the pressure on families and whether the perception of dads is changing, whether their experience of working with dads is changing.
I really want to answer your question, Kathy, but I also want to answer so many more questions that have come up from everything that's been said, especially what Scott's just said. So let me try and focus on your question. But in short, yes, I think that, you know, we work in Glasgow and North Ayrshire as well. And as Scott said, there's some amazing work being done, right? And you obviously work in other parts of Scotland as well. So there's some amazing work being done. But if I'm being honest, sometimes I get frustrated with having had the same conversations. And I know there's people on this call who've been supporting dads longer than we've been supporting dads. But I get frustrated sometimes with the simplicity of having to have the same conversations with health professionals, because I agree with Scott, you know, and as we said, it is a postcode lottery for services, but that feels like a bit of an excuse and a barrier that we put up, because there's some simple things that could take place that are not very expensive. You know, so we run a peer support service for dads in Scotland, and it's really not an expensive service to run. But, you know, we spend a lot of time networking and reminding health professionals about that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Kathy, but certainly I would say that our services have seen an increase in dads looking for support, and dads asking for support themselves as well as professionals looking for support for dads.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I'll crack on, see whether, because we've got limited time. So you're answering this question really. Are you seeing a significant increase in poor mental health in the dads you support, Thomas? I suppose you've just answered that actually, is that yes, is that answer. Anna, are you seeing an increase with your intersection with dads, or your relationship with organizations who are working with dads south of the border?
I think so, yeah. It's difficult to quantify these things. And again, you know, I do longitudinal and qualitative work. So I've sort of talk with fathers, talk with professionals, and we see these things ebb and flow over time. You know, the perinatal period is obviously a period when mental health is, for men, is perhaps most at risk, but certainly I think for those who are experiencing increasing inequality associated with poverty, the challenges balancing work life, then mental health concerns are much higher. There's something around the stigma as well of being a dad, being a marginalized dad, being a stay-at-home father, that is cultural, that we still haven't quite resolved as a society as well. So there's a whole range of different factors at play here that I think are leading to that increase in poor mental health.
Thank you. I think actually there may be some questions around this. Yes, Anna. Dads living in poverty are often stigmatized and portrayed as absent and uncaring. What can we do to challenge these preconceptions? So this is an area that you're probably a leader in, actually.
Yeah, I mean, one of the core questions I take on in Fathering in Poverty is how we again portray men in such a deficit perspective. So we have policymakers still making claims that men in low-income circumstances are feckless. They don't care about their kids. You know, there's a crisis of fatherlessness. You know, and for me, that's quite overblown, really. I think there's certainly evidence to suggest that men are maybe parenting across households, and certainly more than they ever were. And again, there's something about the way that we frame our thinking about fathers as well. So we very often look at sort of measures of poverty or family life within households, but family diversity and the way in which we live has changed over time. Of course, we need more research as well. So the reason I developed my first study around fathering in poverty was because I was hearing all of these narratives and going, well, where's the evidence for this? Who's actually speaking to men in low-income circumstances about being a family member or being a caregiver? What we were doing is we were looking at them as failed workers rather than as involved fathers. And that provides a very different framing of what it is these men are doing to sustain their families over time. So I think we need more evidence. We need more research, whether that's quantitative quantitative, qualitative, or both. But we also need dialogues as well, across sectors, so not just academics, but also professionals and practitioners and those who engage with fathers. You know, there's a translation of this language of absent and uncaring into the risk framework in professional practice. And I think there's something we can do to challenge that by thinking more about father inclusion, and thinking about more compassionate and caring approaches to fathers as resources to their children, but also as human beings in their own right as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably what you're saying about compassion, just generally for one another, actually, is something that seems to be sorely lacking at the moment, and we should be heralding, really. I'm just wondering whether there are any of the other members of the panel would like to comment on either of these points, actually. No? I mean, certainly for me, it's a major issue, and certainly for the last 2 years, seeing such high interaction of dads in SIND1 with their children. Last year was, or the year before, was a really unexpected result, and actually seeing it consistently high again this year is really encouraging for me. And it's how one of the questions I ask myself is, how do we overcome some of those preconceptions and some of those stigmas around men in general, but actually, as you said, kind of men in poverty? You know, how do we change those perceptions and see these men as assets, actually, rather than a deficit model? So thanks for that, Anna. So there's been a welcome focus from the Scottish Government addressing child poverty. But as we've seen, there's this kind of, it feels like a creeping poverty. So we're seeing more dads in SIND 2 and 3 really struggling, actually. I think this year far more than in previous years. And my question is probably to the whole panel, really. How do we extend this support to increase support to dads at the edge of poverty? So, you know, I think that we're probably doing quite well at focusing support on the most deprived families, but it feels like it's a growing problem. So how do we grow the support to meet the needs of an increasing number of families that are struggling? So Anna, I'll ask you first, and then bring in the rest of the panel, I think.
Thank you. I mean, there's a whole range of different things, but again, all of it must be driven by an ethos of care and compassion, which, given the way the world has gone today, is a big ask, unfortunately. However, I think we need to work collaboratively. So again, I talked about previously about dialogues between different sectors. We need dialogues between communities and professionals and policymakers, so that we develop policy and practice environments that meet the needs of people in poverty, and meet the needs of families. There are a whole range of policy reforms, you know, that are fairly, I think probably fairly obvious, but things like a reversal of austerity measures that have defined the last 15 years would be highly welcome. And that includes the removal of the 2-child benefit cap and that limit as well for larger families. I think more support or funding support for families within communities as well. I'm just thinking about the family hub model and how that's been working or not, I guess, around ensuring that, again, communities themselves have some element of ownership and or are able to co-design services that are designed for them. We obviously, I think, need more mental health support as well, and accessible mental health support that's not based on a postcode lottery. Again, all of that is going to be based on funding, and making sure that funding is long-term, sustainable, you know, and not the current model where it's very short-term and you know, ends and then we cycle again and seek to reinvent the wheel all the time. So yeah, a range of different things. I think it's communities, it's practice, it's policy, whole systems change in a way that addresses family poverty and how that's experienced by individuals in the family, but then the whole family system as well.
Thanks very much. I'm just conscious of the time because we're rapidly getting to an hour and a half, which feels incredible to me. Feels like it's flown by. I'm just trying to think. This is possibly the most important question. So dads remain committed to engagement with their children and families post-COVID, despite the increased financial pressure. How do we continue to build on this positive cultural change in the face of severe economic pressure facing families and the public and third sector? So I'm going to just ask you, I think, Thomas, first about this, if that's possible.
We need to be honest with ourselves. I think we need to be honest as a society and as a country as to whether we can continue to build on this positive change. You know, it's clear to me that families are changing, families have changed, families want different things, but there's still so many structures and systems in place that make things harder than they need to be. And therefore it's hard to say right now that we see lots of positivity coming from the Scottish Government and coming from funders. You know, I see that Shared Parent Scotland are on the call, obviously Fathers Network, both meant to be national Scottish organisations, but you know, the funding that both those organisations receive is really quite small in the scheme of things. So the impact that you need to have with so little funding is really challenging and really tough. And you know, we don't seem to talk about the honesty of how tough things are for the third sector in this country, and how many charities we've lost in the last few weeks that I'm sure we could all count. We don't really seem to recognise the charities that are doing really good work that then just suddenly disappear. So, you know, things are really tough for the third sector just now, and things are quite precarious for organisations. And, you know, this survey that you produce every year is really fundamental and really vital, but we need to actually see that the Scottish Government and the other big funders in Scotland actually read this and understand this. I mean, if you look at the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund, which is a Scottish Government fund, it doesn't actually even have men as one of the categories of someone that we want to support. All the categories within the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund are women or children, but it's called the Whole Family Fund. And I think, to go back to your point, Kathy, about the UNCRC, if we're serious about that, if we're serious about the articles within that, where it talks about the whole family, it talks about equal equality for family members and parents, then we need to actually start being serious and living by that. So I think it is a really tough position just now for charities, and I think, you know, collaboration is the way, right? And collaboration is what's going to help, but that takes time and that takes energy, and it's hard sometimes to keep doing the day job and keep doing the thing that is about supporting families and being there for families and looking after staff, as well as trying to actually perhaps change the whole system and perhaps apply for funding as a part of a collaborative. All these things take time and energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It seems like when you're as familiar as you and I and Scott and Anna all realize what significant system change is required actually to get towards equality. It does feel like an enormous tanker to turn. And I'm just wondering whether any of the other panel members, I'm just again conscious of time, but any of the other panel members wanted to talk about even despite it being such an enormous challenge, where you think that we ought to start. I mean, my feeling is actually paternity leave is a good place as any to start, because you're putting a line in the sand and saying that actually both parents matter, actually. So it's taking the UNCRC and actually saying, okay, well, you know, we're going to invest and we value both parents right at the start. But I'm just wondering whether Carole, Anna, Scott, you had your own thoughts about that.
I mean, I'd agree with you, Kathy, on the paternity leave. I do think that's a good place to start. But I also think, you know, I've gone to spend time with Thomas and some of the dads at one of the groups he runs in Edinburgh. And actually, if you realise when you speak to people, the difference that some of these sort of environments can make. And one dad in particular, it was the only time he left the house with his son because of his own mental health problems was to go to that. And the lifeline that some of these groups have, it's almost like a collective responsibility here to make sure that locally people are aware and trying to campaign hard. And people don't have the time or the inclination, but I think there needs to be a collective effort to try and make sure those in power understand the implications, as particularly a moment with finances, with the squeeze on the third sector. It's very, very difficult, but in many cases, they're doing the job of councils, they're doing the job of health boards. And if they start to lose that, they then have to pick up these pieces. And I don't know if that's always recognised.
I mean, I think the other element of this is, in my mind, it's how much it'll cost if you don't act, actually. And if we don't support these parents on the fringes of poverty or that are really struggling, actually, the bill associated with that, the cost of that to the public purse is probably enormous, actually. I don't know what the calculations are, but I can imagine it's really significant, actually. So, going upstream of the problem and trying to solve it, I think is probably money well spent, actually, from a government's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think back to the point I made before about childcare, that's a crucial part of this system. It's a cost that many families cannot afford. And so it prevents someone, usually the mother, going back to work. If we can start to identify ways to, it's not a small problem, but to try and resolve some of that, that has a bigger implication for the whole country's finances. And that would to us be a crucial part of this as well.
Thanks. I'm realizing that we're running over slightly. Is it anybody got any final thoughts before we wrap up? Thanks very much. Well, just finally, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody who's come along today to hear about the findings. As I said, right at the top, we'll send out an email to everybody who's come along today with a copy of the report and the slides from the event. I wanted to say an enormous thank you to the panel. So thanks to Thomas and Scott, Anna and Carole for coming along and sharing their thoughts and their experience and insight with us. It's been really fantastic to have you along and just taking time out of your busy, very busy lives. So thank you for that. Also, a huge thank you to Jessica and to Connor, who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes, getting the report together and helping get the event up and running. So a huge thank you to them. And of course, the dads, I don't know whether we've got any of the dads who participated on the call today, but if you are one of those dads that filled in the survey, just thanks so much for taking the time out to share your experiences of what it's like to be a dad right now. We really, as I said, it's not incentivized, and we get enormous numbers of dads getting involved in these surveys every year. So a huge thank you to you. And we will do our very best to make sure that the people who deal with policy and can help change some of these issues know all about what you've said. So we will make sure that we pass all of this information on to them.